In February 2009, President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The stimulus, the massive deficit spending package, bailed out state and local governments, funded allegedly shovel-ready infrastructure projects, and poured money into Democratic lawmakers' favorite federal programs. The administration projected that if Congress passed that plan back then, unemployment would not top 8%. It was 7.8% at the time. Today, it's 9.1%. So what now? Do we cut spending or double down with a bigger stimulus? Once again, here's Doug McKelway.
The economic devastation of the Great Depression was far worse than our recession of today. The banking business was shut down. 1 out of 4 workers was unemployed. International trade slowed by 50%. But the solutions then and now were modeled on the same top-down approach. In 1933, it was called the New Deal. It transformed the U.S. with an array of social programs for the needy and public works programs to build infrastructure and to put Americans back to work. It cemented the strength of unions, regulated the banks, and created Social Security. But it didn't end the Depression. Only World War II did that. 76 years later, as historians still debate the New Deal's effect, a new financial crisis brought on a new stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a $787 billion top-down torrent of cash for infrastructure, for preventing teacher layoffs, for staving off the bankruptcy of GM and Chrysler, and for thousands of other projects across the 50 states. Did it work?
It was a bit of a mess. They wanted to get it through quickly, so they sort of handed the reins to Congress, and so you got everybody in every district wanting some of it. So I think it could have been handled better. Do I think it helped? I do think it helped because the economy really was in free fall, and so this just added a little more money to the system and helped the recession be not quite as severe as it would have been. Was it enough to avoid this huge downturn? No, obviously it wasn't.
The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office found the stimulus helped the economy. It found that by the second quarter of the year 2010, it raised the gross domestic product by between 1.7 and 4.5%, that it lowered the unemployment rate by between 0.7% and 1.8%, and increased the number of people who had jobs by between 1.4 and 3.3 million. Similarly, the New Deal helped lower the massive unemployment rate, and it resulted in profoundly beneficial infrastructure improvements, from the electrification of the rural Tennessee Valley to the transformation of parts of the arid West into farmable land. But just as then, debate centers today on whether private or public spending works best to heal a wounded economy.
We have to understand, government spending has to come from somewhere. The government doesn't have money of its own. In order for the government to spend money, it has to take it from a different place in the economy. It has to either tax people or it has to borrow it. And these actually bring negative things very often.
While DeRougy argues that the best stimulus is to leave money in the pockets of the people who make it, Brookings Institution economist Martin Bailey argues a top-down approach is needed in times of crisis.
I think a recession is a time when we really are short of jobs, short of demand. People are not spending enough to employ the economy. So that if you can take the government and take some of its spending and add it to the private spending, I don't think that is causing private spending to go down. There's maybe some offset, but we saw, if we look around the world, you see that China had a big stimulus package, was very successful for them. Some of the countries in Europe that have followed a tight austerity road, they have seen actually very severe situations. So I'm not inclined to, conventional economics is if you add spending, at least in the short run. By the way, I'm not a big fan of adding spending over the long run, but this was a crisis.
There is, of course, a middle ground, one that's reflected in public-private partnerships. The United States has created many of those that have resulted in great benefit to mankind and to the economy. Take, for example, the creation of the Internet. One of its founders, Robert Kahn, has said that it never would have been possible without the investment of the federal government. And that brings us to our next way to save the economy: long-term government spending.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
The United States met Kennedy's goal 8 years later in what many still regard as the greatest achievement of mankind. Through Apollo, Kennedy wanted to demonstrate to the Soviets the superiority of the capitalist system. But ironically, the landing was only achieved through a vast government bureaucracy at massive taxpayer expense, which Kennedy freely admitted.
None will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Adjusted in 2005 dollars, it's estimated that the Apollo program cost $170 billion. But Apollo also produced benefits that we see in everyday life. The integrated circuit developed for Apollo led 20 years later to the proliferation of the home computer, and in part to the tech revolution, and led again to what scientists today call Moore's Law, which holds that the number of transistors that can fit on any given integrated circuit is being doubled every 2 years. In other words, as cell phones, computers, and all kinds of communications devices get progressively smaller, their power increases exponentially. Some say that fact may be the genesis of a new technological and economic revolution.
If you look back at that time, I don't think anyone predicted how strongly the effect of Moore's Law and the cheapness of computers and of telecommunications, what that was going to do. Since then, we've had a lot of things like search engines, a lot of software stuff. These technologies are allowing us to do amazing things. Then there are other material sciences technologies that we can manipulate. There are life sciences technologies that are coming along. So I don't get a sense that there's a shortage of new technologies. But obviously we've got to get past this housing slump and the banking crisis and all that before we can really take advantage of that stuff.
Today, government is now expanding broadband coverage, as it did with electrical power in rural America 75 years ago, or the interstate highway system decades later. But rapid change means many jobs lost in the recession will never come back. Some now call for an emphasis on retraining workers.
It's probably a mixture of local government, state government, and federal government initiative with the private sector to produce an educational system and beyond educational. I don't think it's K-12. I don't even know that it's college. It's probably continual learning. You know, how are we going to take the 40-year-old unemployed person who's been out of work for 12 or 18 months and give them skills that they need to take a job that does exist? That's, I think, a really big challenge.
Some critics say that for every Apollo program, there's another long-term massive government program that did not produce such inspiring results.
We're already spending gigantic amount of money on roads. We are spending gigantic amount of money on education. I mean, the government, every single budget year, the government, whether he's a Republican or he is a Democrat, tells us how they're investing in our future, and it doesn't seem to be paying off at all.
Economists are evenly divided over whether long-term government spending programs work, but most agree there are times when the private sector may have the inspiration and the know-how, but lacks the money to carry out a new idea. In that regard, they say, government can play a key role in helping to grow the economy.
Coming up, America versus the rest of the world after the break.